Welcome to Leading Days of Service, a webinar for VISTA leaders. As a VISTA leader, you may be responsible for coordinating community events that rely on volunteer service, or you may support VISTA members with similar responsibilities. This session will provide strategies for leading these events that you can use or that you can share with your members. I'm your host, Andy King, Senior Training Specialist with AmeriCorps VISTA. And I'm delighted to introduce our presenter, Malia Hadidian-Titchener. Malia works as the coordinator of the Student Community Engagement Center at Portland State University. She also leads volunteer management trainings for the Northwest Oregon Volunteer Administrators Association. Before returning to service coordination within higher ed, Malia worked at Hands-On Greater Portland, a local volunteer center, where she first served as an AmeriCorps member and then as an AmeriCorps lead before landing a full-time position with the organization. Of course, it's always great to have an AmeriCorps alum with us, so a big welcome to you, Malia. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Andy. I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk with you all about the ins and outs of leading a day of service and how you all can support your VISTA leaders in putting on a meaningful support your team as VISTA leaders in putting on that meaningful, well-organized, and hopefully fun service opportunity. So let's take a look at what we're hoping to get out of our time together. So we're going to start by reviewing the purpose and the elements of a day of service project. What is it? Then we're going to dig into what a run of show is and how to create one for your event. We'll talk through how to identify the different roles needed and how to build an implementation team to cover all of the day of to-dos, as well as tips on training your event leads. And finally, we'll cover a few key leadership tips to support a successful event day. But first, let's ground ourselves. What is a day of service? So you probably already have some idea about what we mean when we say that, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, typically a day of service is a set time, often a half or sometimes a full day, when individuals come together to volunteer with one or more organizations to address a community need. Service days may center around a certain issue, such as food insecurity, or they can be much broader in scope, focusing generally on the value of service or coming together as a community. Often, these events are planned around designated national days of service, and for AmeriCorps, that includes Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service in January and the September 11th National Day of Service and Remembrance. However, sometimes days of service are simply designed to meet the needs of a certain community or organization and aren't associated with a specific day of the year. Days of service can be big or small. You might want to bring out your team to a small project at a single site that engages just your AmeriCorps crew, say, working a shift at the local food bank. In other situations, you might be helping support and lead a much larger day of service with multiple sites and a goal of engaging the public in the service. Both types of projects can be very impactful, both for the participants and for the organizations served, as long as they're well-planned, well-executed, and have a clear purpose. So as a VISTA leader, your role in planning, supporting, or leading days of service will probably look different depending on your organization or your sponsor. Your role may be to initiate that day of service project, or maybe propose a few ideas, and then work with your VISTA team to collaboratively plan the event. As a leader, it's a great opportunity to consider how collaborative planning can help meet the professional development needs of your team. If you and your team are starting from the very beginning of the planning process, I do encourage you to watch our previous VISTA webinar focused on those initial planning stages of day of service events. And you can find that initial webinar on the VISTA campus. In other instances, you might be stepping up to help lead an event or a project that's kind of already been identified and starting to be fleshed out. This is kind of where we're going to be starting from today, in which case it is really helpful to understand the best practices surrounding a day of service. But often as a VISTA leader, you're not actually the one leading the charge, right? So instead, your role may be to provide that support, that enthusiasm, and resources for your VISTA members who are planning and leading separate service days at their individual sites. So even if you're not the one leading the day of service, having a solid set of service event leadership tips and resources available to share back with your members is going to set your teammates up for success. Whatever the circumstance, it's helpful to clarify your role and those of your team members really early on in the process so your team is on the same page throughout the planning and implementation. So, for any project you might be leading or supporting, it's always important to ensure first and foremost that you understand and can communicate the purpose of the project. I call this the why behind the event. So, most days of service at their core are aimed to meet a community need with the support of one time volunteers. Look at the project you're preparing to lead and really ask yourself, what is the actual community need this project is addressing? It might feel obvious in the case of some direct service projects, such as serving meals to neighbors experiencing housing insecurity, but many day of service projects support more behind the scenes efforts, such as sorting book donations or maybe helping touch up the paint in a school gym. So, whatever the project is, make sure you really understand the larger impact on the community of the work that you're going to be doing, and think about how you're going to communicate that to volunteers. Days of service may also have secondary whys that guide what the event looks like. So, relationship building is a very common secondary why. Even if meeting a community need is maybe the driving factor behind your day of service, that opportunity for relationship building can be a close second reason to bring folks together to serve. We might want to build connections between our members and the greater community, or we might want to just hope to provide that opportunity to come together as a VISTA team and engage in something meaningful as a group. Education is another common secondary why. Service days can be great opportunities for volunteers to deepen their understanding of important community issues and the work that community members are doing to address them. And then days of service can also encourage the development of new partnerships. They can increase your program visibility and provide an easy way for people to get involved with your organization. So I'll share an example from my own day of service experience, and we're going to use this example and revisit it throughout the webinar. So years ago, I got involved with an organization known as the Binky Patrol, whose mission was to bring a little warmth and comfort to children in difficult circumstances through the gift of a handmade blanket. The blankets were sent to shelters, to hospitals, to clinics, and other places that requested them for the young clients they served. The Binky Patrol's large-scale, what we called Binkathon events, were designed to bring groups of sewers and non-sewers alike together to make as many blankets as possible in a single day. The purpose of the events was clearly, well, we needed to make blankets, but we needed to help volunteers understand the larger why of the event. Who were the recipients that the blankets were going to, and how that handmade blanket could offer care and comfort. Without that context, folks might have fun making the blankets, but completely miss the larger purpose. Secondarily, these large-scale events served as a kind of community gathering place for sewers who were looking for ways to leverage their skills for good. So these primary and secondary whys shaped how we structured, introduced, and led these blanket making events. So now we'd actually like to hear from you all what else you think might be a possible secondary why for this type of blanket making Binkathon event. I'll pass it to you, Andy.
All right, thanks, Malia. So let's take a moment to consider the example that Malia just shared of the Binkathon project and its whys. So we'll use the chat for this activity, and please be sure you're sending your message to everyone. So Malia shared one primary and a secondary why behind her blanket making project. We'd like to hear from you on this question. What could be another secondary why for this type of blanket making event? We'll put some music on and give you about a minute or so to share your ideas. All right, well, we've had a couple of thoughts come in. One potential why could be to offer warmth to homeless persons or others in need. It could be to build relationships within the community. That is, the act of creating something together often bonds community members to one another. It could be helping others to create job opportunities, right? So getting to know people in the community and maybe learning about skills or other opportunities there. Again, provide warmth and comfort to the homeless community, to build relationships, to feel the appreciation coming back from the community when these blankets are delivered. So yeah, that sense of appreciation and that great feeling you get when you're recognized for doing some good. Thank you for sharing all of those examples of potential secondary whys. Leah, did anything stand out to you among these?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think building relationships within the community definitely stands out. We would have some groups that would come back year after year and look forward to the Binkathon as that opportunity to come together and do good and see other groups that they recognize. So it really did serve as a community builder. And I can say one thing that we came up with as another secondary why, specifically within that, was to create a family-friendly event that could help parents instill the value of volunteering in their children and come together and be with other families doing service. So this was especially important to our Binky Patrol founder because she brought her kids to every event, so it had to be family-friendly. And she's like, what if we made that one of our secondary whys? So it's one of the reasons that we wanted to include roles in our project that weren't just like sewing heavy roles. You didn't have to need to use a sewing machine. We wanted to make sure that folks with kids as young as 6 could come and help out. All right, so thank you for that. So let's see here. Once you have a good understanding of your why, you want to take a moment to review the more practical details that define the project you're going to be leading. So this is your who, your what, your when, your where. These are the basic elements of a day of service project plan, which should already have been determined in the initial planning process. So I'll use the Binkathon as an example. So who, right? You want to know who's going to participate in the event as volunteers, funders, sponsors, who's going to benefit from the service, you know, either the host site or the community members themselves. In the case of our Binkathon project, we knew the target volunteer audience was going to be primarily made up of those avid sewers, as well as the families we were targeting that wanted kid-friendly service opportunities. We also had a fabric sponsor, a community partner that was going to be receiving those blankets. So all of those audiences encompassed our who. For the what, we need to understand what volunteers are actually going to accomplish during the project, and importantly, what skills they need to come in the door with versus those that can be taught on the day of. So clearly for our project, we needed to have some people with existing sewing skills who could bring those machines, but we also had other jobs that didn't involve sewing. For the when, the date and time should be clear, and do make sure that you know how early you as a lead need to show up. It's also good to consider any timing elements related to weather, to traffic, to meal time. So at the Binkathon, we knew we were working across a lunch hour and we needed to plan in time for a lunch break. And then for the where, you want to make sure you know where folks are going to meet up on the day of the project, how they might be arriving. So you can include those details like parking or transit options in any reminders you're going to be sending. And you'll want to consider in advance the actual space. Where do you want to gather the group to kick things off, to take a break to eat, to lead a closing reflection? So at the Binkathon, we were able to use an elementary school cafeteria, which had plenty of tables available and a lot of room to spread out, which was awesome. But we also had access to a play structure outside, which was perfect because we realized families with kids are probably going to need to take lots of breaks throughout the day. So the how, of course, is the next element, is an important part of the service project plan and kind of a crucial piece of bringing the idea from that fruition, or bringing the project from idea to fruition. Much of that how should have taken place long before the week or the project itself. This includes things like confirming the basic project plan, writing a project description for recruitment purposes, creating a timeline, and doing a site visit to ensure that you have a feel for your project location. We're kind of assuming for the purpose of this webinar that those elements are already done. But there are plenty of hows that need to be considered as you come up on the event itself and think about your leadership on the day of, so that it can run smoothly from start to finish. More often than we might want to admit, a great idea falls flat in execution because somewhere along the way, the folks implementing it lacked a clear day of plan or a chain of communication. So, thinking through the day of the event in detail from start to end will help you identify the most important tasks, and these details create the foundation for what we call our run of show. So, a run of show is a straightforward but detailed guide that outlines the order and schedule of everything that's going to happen at your service project and who is responsible for each piece. It brings that who, what, when, where, how kind of into the details and breaks down every minute of an event from start to finish. So, run of shows really serve as that script for how the day is going to go. It's different from the day's general agenda, which is often high level and shared with public attendees. The run of show is private, it's a detailed behind the scenes guide for your day of implementation team to follow. And while it might feel like overkill, I promise you that having that run of show to guide your event can provide you and your team with peace of mind and help avoid the chaos, the timing woes, and often miscommunication that can come from just winging it. So, a well crafted run of show is going to include a specific timeline that outlines the sequence and length of each activity included in your event, including setup and cleanup. It's going to have clearly defined roles that designate who is responsible for each task. It's going to have a clear description of the associated logistics, like any supplies you might need or audiovisual needs, and any communication details, such as cues or talking points for each section. The run of show document should be chronological in order, and they're often set up using tables or columns for clarity. You may also consider using color coding to help with visual comprehension. That said, you'll want to assess what format works best for your team, as the use of tables in a document or color coding isn't always accessible to folks who might use screen readers, experience color blindness, or have other accessibility concerns. So check in with your team. Run of shows are used for all sorts of events, from conferences to concerts to career days. But for days of service specifically, there are common components that you want to think through to determine what they would look like for your service day and how they're going to fit into your run of show. So, we'll share a few of the most important things to consider in each of these sections, and you'll also get a handout that you can refer to next time you're putting together a day of service event. So, first up, all projects require some sort of setup before the main volunteers show up for the day. So think about your event setup needs and what needs to be in place the time that volunteers arrive, right? So supplies might need to be dropped off that morning. Sometimes supplies is already on site, depending on the project. In the case of the Bankathon event, we had a lot of sewing supplies that needed to make it to the school cafeteria well before volunteers arrived. So we made sure to note on our run of show that supplies needed to be dropped off a full hour and a half before the event's official start time. From boxes of fabric to quilting batting to scissors, irons, ironing boards, we had a lot of material and different project stations to set up, so we really needed that time. We knew we also needed time to set up the registration table with sign-in sheets, name tags, photo waivers, as well as time to put up signage before volunteers arrive. And as part of our setup time, we did carve out time in the run of show for a 15-minute leader huddle. All of our leads were trained in advance on their specific roles, but that leader huddle on the day of gave us the time to share last-minute updates, answer lingering questions, and introduce folks to each other to get everybody jazzed about their roles and the bigger picture goals of the day. The start of your event is going to set the stage for the rest of the day. So, as you put together your run of show, I encourage you to stop and think about what needs to happen between the time that volunteer parks their car or gets off the bus and when they are, say, handed a shovel for planting a tree. If it's a small project, a single person with a clipboard and some name tags to hand out might suffice for check-in, but any sort of large project really requires some, waivers, pre-registration, different project assignments or name tags. That's going to benefit from an actual registration table. In your run of show, I encourage you to make sure your registration station is set up a good 20 to 30 minutes before the start of the project, and ideally staffed until 20 to 30 minutes after things begin, because you're always going to have those early birds that show up before you're ready for them, and you'll probably have folks trickling in late. So having a plan for navigating this is going to ensure that everyone gets properly checked in. If you're planning to assign volunteers to different project areas upon their arrival, I love using color-coded stickers or maybe a symbol in the corner of a name tag for each area, so folks can easily figure out where to go by just looking for who has a similar name tag than them. Once you've got volunteers signed in, you're going to want to plan for a kickoff or official welcome, followed by a general orientation to help folks connect with that all-important why. So they should be heading into the project with an understanding of how their service actually relates to the larger purpose of the event, and perhaps learn a bit more about the issues they are helping address. The kickoff is also a good time to introduce the day's agenda and cover some basic housekeeping details, such as the general schedule for the day, where to find the bathrooms, if and when you'll break for food, and if you can get parking validated or any other details like that. And then once those volunteers have gotten that high level welcome and orientation, it's time to plan out the nitty gritty of what they're actually there to accomplish. So before saying go forth and volunteer, you want to ensure that there's a plan for training folks on how to do what you're asking them to do. So during the Binkathon, we sent all of our non-sewing volunteers to help with things like cutting fabric, ironing fabric strips, pinning batting and backing onto the finished tops of the blankets. And it became very clear very quickly that all of these tasks do require a little demonstration, especially how to pin fabric effectively before handing it to a sewer, before we wanted to let volunteers loose at their task. So training volunteers for their specific tasks and really ensuring they know how to do it safely is different from that high level orientation and sometimes missed when we create our run of show document. So once you have that training, from here, your run of show might have a long chunk of time labeled something like doing the work. And if you've set things in motion with a well-planned kickoff, orientation, training, safety talk, volunteers will hopefully feel confident digging into their roles. But it doesn't mean they won't have questions, right? So this is where your monitoring and managing lead roles come in. You want to make sure it's clear who volunteers can go to with questions, where to replenish supplies, and what to do when they finish the project they've been assigned. For longer events, you'll also want to indicate in the run of show when you recommend the group takes breaks, and if breaks can happen simultaneously or if they should be staggered so the work can continue. Finally, while you can't quite pinpoint a complete list of problems that might crop up, part of supervising the work is problem solving in the moment. So it can be really helpful to jot into your run of show just some considerations for addressing common issues that you think might arise.
All right, so on that topic, let's take a moment to dig into this need to brainstorm what could possibly go wrong at an event and try to plan for it in advance. So thinking again about the Binkathon blanket making event that Malia's been talking about, what issues could you foresee coming up at this type of event? What do you think could be prepared in advance to help the problem or to problem solve these issues if they arise during the event? So again, what things could possibly happen, what things could go wrong, and how could you then problem solve? So we'll put some music on and give you about a minute to respond. All right, well, we've got a number of responses in already, and those include injuries. Obviously, no matter what the project, folks could get hurt, so having first aid kit available, making sure you have enough supplies for the event, enough materials. Rain, of course, is an issue, or other kind of severe weather, maybe it's extreme heat. If you have an outdoor event, so it's helpful to have a rain date or an alternate location or a tent. Another problem is not enough time for setup, especially for an early morning event. So the solution might be to set up the day before, if that's possible. Loss of power is a possibility, so maybe having another power source like a generator. And emergency health issues, natural disaster, or other security issues. So great ideas here. Thank you for sharing. Malia, did anything stand out for you among these ideas?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the first one on there, first aid, when you have a whole bunch of people with a lot of sharp needles and scissors, that's definitely a consideration that we had at the Binkathon for sure. We had a number of first aid kits. We did have to use a number of Band-Aids, so kind of being prepared for that was important. Rain, well, one time we did it in January for MLK Day, and guess what? It like iced over and completely snowed. So we really had to have a communication plan in place to ensure that was the space open? Was it actually safe for folks to come? So we kind of knew that was a weather pattern coming up. The event did continue, but it was about half the size that it was, intended to be just because of travel. And so we kind of had to think about, okay, if we have fewer volunteers, how do we make sure that we can still have a successful event? I'm also seeing, yeah, supplies. We had like, I don't know, probably twice as much fabric as we thought we needed. And we also had somebody designated as a runner if we ran out. And sure enough, one year we ran out of the batting, which goes inside of the blankets. And we had one person who knew exactly where the nearest Joann's Fabrics was, who could like go out and get us any supplies that we ran out of. So really having those people kind of designated beforehand and thinking about those things beforehand can really help keep things moving smoothly on the day of the event. So these are great suggestions. Definitely things you want to be thinking about as you head into your projects. All right, so the next step is thinking about wrapping up. So thinking through your project's end, consider what kind of cleanup that you want your volunteers to do versus what you're going to leave for the event staff to wrap up after your volunteers leave. Obviously, the more you can involve people in cleaning up their own areas, the faster everything's going to go. But you don't want folks to get so focused on the cleanup that they begin to peel off without having that chance to come back together as a group and do a closeout. So too often volunteers will kind of get wrapped up in the cleaning up, and then they're going to leave without that sense of closure and celebration that can really mean the difference between feeling okay about what they did and having a true appreciation for the role they played in the day's accomplishments. Think about what makes sense for your group as a closing. So are you going to circle everyone back up for a closing reflection and thank you and maybe take a big group after picture? Or is it going to be easier if volunteers close out and debrief with their individual project groups? However you do it, don't forget to add a note in your run of show to remind folks that that's going to happen and to stick around for the final closing. So once volunteers have left, the implementation team are going to be the last ones standing, helping with the final breakdown. Be realistic about the amount of time and hands you think you'll need. So after our first Binkathon event, we had a lot of hands helping us pack up the finished blankets and the unused fabric, but two of us made the mistake of saying to the rest of the team, I think we got it. And, you can leave. And then we looked around after everybody had left and realized we had 24 tables and 100 chairs to fold and stack, not to mention an entire cafeteria floor to sweep. We didn't make that mistake again. The next time we planned the event, we really made sure that the full team could stick around till the last chair was stacked. So while it might feel like that huge sigh of relief when that floor is finally swept, the building door is locked, cleanup isn't actually the end of a project. Following up after that project is a best practice that is often forgotten in that relief of finishing a big event day. So whether you plan to follow up on the same day of the project or in the days that follow, I always include this list in a final run of show section as kind of a reminder of the tasks that need to still be in mind as you've left the premises. So, sending thank you emails, ideally with some pictures included of the volunteers in action and maybe a tally of the results, can really go a long way in helping volunteers reconnect to what they did and the why. You can include both an evaluation survey and information of how to stay involved if they'd like to volunteer again. Same goes for thanking and asking for feedback from any of your partners. Finally, think ahead and plan a time for your implementation team to also debrief, ideally within a week of the event, so it's fresh in everyone's minds. I personally love to use the SWOT format to get feedback from teams. So SWOT stands for strengths. So what were the strengths of the events? W is weaknesses. What opportunities or ideas do we have to make things better if we do this again? And were there any threats or things outside of our control, like that ice storm, that might have impacted the day and things that we might want to be aware of moving forward if we do it again? So it might not be officially a part of the day of run of show, but one of the other things that I think is important to outline as you prepare for your event day is what needs to happen in the 24 hours leading up to volunteers' arrival. So you can really make sure you have all your ducks in a row. So Once I've done my run of show document, I'll use it then to create what I call a 24-hour checklist. And that includes all the little but often important things that need to be done or confirmed in those 24 hours before the event starts. So if you haven't sent a reminder to your volunteers already by that time, that would go on the list. This also is the time to check back with your day of leadership team to ensure everyone knows when they are expected to arrive. If your project is outdoors or are there any concerns about the weather, especially true again around that MLK Day of Service in January, please make sure to check the forecast and consider any alternate plans. You should be doing one last review of your supplies at this point, making sure you've got everything from tools to sign-in sheets to pens, name tags, and that ever useful blue painter's tape for putting up signs without leaving marks on the walls. And don't underestimate the value of good signage at your event. So in that 24-hour before the event, I always print up a batch of signs with the event name, and then I have arrows pointing in all different directions. That gives me the option when I show up at the event itself of adding additional wayfinding signs, especially if it's not really clear where volunteers should be checking in. And I also stash blank paper and Sharpies in the supply box because you never know when you're going to have to create a sign on the fly once the project is underway. So now that you've got your draft run of show, you should be able to pull out a list of the roles you'll need to fill to ensure everything gets done within the time allotted. More than likely, you're not going to be able to do all of the roles, right? It's important to consider your own capacity. If you had all the time in the world, maybe you could do everything on your run of show list, but when they all need to get done over a couple hours, the tasks really do become untenable. So if you need some ideas for how to turn run of show tasks into those volunteer roles, I encourage you to check out the sample roles handout for ideas. It has everything from, your registration manager to the safety nerd to the event photographer, to name just a few. And not all of these roles need separate individuals to fill them. Most of the time, your team is going to be wearing a variety of hats on the day of the project. The key is to ensure that no one is assigned to do too many things simultaneously, and that includes you. So once you have your list of roles identified, I recommend kind of listing them out by general time frame. So what's happening during setup? What are the roles that are happening as you're kind of welcoming folks, and then group all of those different roles that make sense but don't overlap in time. So roles may be grouped based on similar skill sets or, location of where somebody might be at the project, or maybe a special mix of skills a specific person has. So this is an example of how I grouped some roles for the blanket making event. In looking at the different sections of the day, like setup, arrival, service, it was clear that those serving, say, as sewing area experts could be tapped to help set up their stations, train new volunteers on their specific tasks, oversee the work at their stations, and clean up and pack any leftover supplies all within their sewing station. One thing I'll say is that we did not have a fully freshed out run of show at our first Binkathon event. So instead of looking at the different roles like this to actually figure out, well, how many people do we actually need on our implementation team? We just looked at who we knew was committed and then tried to divvy out all the roles to those 3 people. Well, that was the problem. We only had 3 of us confirmed to pull off a many stationed 100-person event. So one of us was working the registration table and dealing with stragglers, while the other person oriented our sewers to the sewing machine tasks. And then we had one person, our mighty founder, running around in a frenzy trying to orient and train every single non-sewer to 5 different potential stations scattered across the room. It was chaos. So after that first event, we really found this run of show model and determined the best way forward was to recruit leads to be those area experts to help lead each of those sewing and non-sewing stations. Even if you're bringing a large group together to do just one activity, like a trash cleanup, that's the only thing everybody's doing. I do find that as a general rule of thumb, having one area lead for every 10 to 15 individuals does help ensure a more positive and less frenetic experience for the volunteers and the leads alike.
All right, so Malia just shared the myriad roles that need to happen at a Binkathon event. And next, we want to give you the opportunity to work with this example through an online whiteboard activity using a whiteboard called Mural. So I'm going to take a moment, going to share my screen here and demonstrate how to do this, but first I want to identify the focus of the activity. So keeping in mind the role grouping example that Malia just shared, we'd like you to group together roles that you could assign to one lead. That is, which role from across each section of the day would you put together for one person? You'll have about a minute, minute and a half to create the role groupings on your own, and then we'll see what everyone came up with as a group. So I'm going to demonstrate how to use this whiteboard tool for this role grouping activity. So to participate, first you'll select a link once we post it into the chat to access the whiteboard. After you select the link, you'll be presented with this option here. Click View as Visitor at the bottom, and the next screen comes up. Click View as Visitor a second time. And then once you're in the mural, you may need to zoom out so you can see the entire board, but it should look like this. And what we're going to ask you to do is use one of the tools from the menu on the left side. So you see this black toolbar on the left. We're going to use the draw tool, which is right near the bottom of the list. Before drawing, we recommend that you go up to the top of the screen and pick the marker tool. Use the little squiggly thing to bump up the width of your line, and then you can use this teardrop color drop to select a color. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a bright color that you'll be able to see. Once I've done that, I can draw. And so I'm going to just mirror what Malia just showed, that she could group together the roles related to pinning. So she showed these with bold, but I'm going to use my drawing tool to draw it here, pinning, pinning, pinning. If you make a mistake, go back up to this top menu, and on the left, you'll see an undo button, so you can just erase it and go back and do it again. So we're going to give you, I don't think it'll take you much time, but we'll give you a little bit of time to group some things together. You might want to change color and do a second grouping. And then once you do that, you'll be doing it individually on your own whiteboard. And then once you're done, we're going to pull them all together and show them as a group. So it should be interesting. We're gonna put some music on and give you a chance to start. And if you need reference, the instructions are back on the screen in Zoom, so you can take a look there. Oh, and looks like, well, I think you probably all have had enough time to have a chance to do your marking. So we're going to end private mode and see if we can show all of the all of the lines at the same time if the mural board is going to work as we think it should. And if not, then well, I don't know that we can see them all at once. We tested this out last week, and it looked like we would see everybody's lines at the same time, but we're not. I was watching several of you as you were going in and making your markings, and it looked like we had some similar things happening where folks were, especially in the expert area, as we demonstrated, like pinning in each of the 4 categories. And others of you, as you can see on the screen, say registration table setup, makes sense for that person to then staff the registration, check-in table. During the event, maybe wander around, take photos, and then assist with breakdown. So it looks like you all got this activity. Sorry, the technology didn't show exactly as we thought it would. But anyway, I'll turn it back over to Malia to continue on.
Yeah, so this is just an example of a kind of way that you can go about taking what you've done in your run of show and figuring out how you want to group those assignments. It's helpful because you want to make sure that nothing gets overlooked, right? You don't want to show up on the day of and realize that, oh, we didn't get anybody to take photos. And you want to make sure that you're not the one that takes on all of those roles, right, if they're not assigned. Thinking about timing is an important piece of this. So timing as well as concentration and skill set required for each role. So area experts, we don't want them running back and forth between stations like our Binkathon founder did, especially if they're halfway across a gymnasium. And this is especially true when you're working with less experienced volunteers, with kids, with families, where you might need to have a more intense eye on what's happening. Other than being an overwhelming task, it could also be a safety issue. So you want to make sure that you've got things properly staffed. So let's now start thinking about, if you do have holes, if you do need to recruit more people, who can you recruit to fill those roles? So you do want to make sure that you have a good size implementation team. Don't do what we did and think we could do it with 3 when we had 100 people coming. So your implementation team is the group of people that are going to make that project happen, both on the event day and in the day, leading up to it. And unless your project is a very small one, maybe you're just taking your VISTA team out, and that's fine. You're probably going to need more than one person, right? So you might already know who's going to be helping out. Maybe your entire VISTA team are going to be sharing leadership, and your main issue is really thinking about that divvying of roles. But if you're still figuring out your team members, and your run of show is going to be your friend in terms of identifying the holes in your implementation team, whether in knowledge and capacity, and giving you some solid roles to recruit for. So on the one hand, if there was anybody that was involved in the initial planning stages of the event that hasn't already been confirmed, they would obviously be naturals to serve on that implementation team, but you can't always assume they're going to be willing and available on the day of the event. So you do want to make sure that they recommit to being at the project itself and clarify what their role is going to be. But if you do find the need to recruit more day of leads, one big population is considering reaching out to past volunteers and inviting them to step up as leads. That's how we recruited all of our area experts. They had been to a prior Binkathon. We saw that they enjoyed what was happening, and we asked them if they'd be interested in stepping up and really being more of an official support to other people who might be new to the event. You can also reach out to affinity groups, to clubs, to putting out good old-fashioned flyers, or sometimes there's online recruitment systems, especially important if you're looking for folks with a particular skill set. So those are just some examples of areas you can reach out to, folks you can reach out to ask to serve as a lead. And then once you have kind of that willing team excited to help lead on the day of the event, do take the time to collaboratively assign roles that you didn't already recruit somebody specifically for. So this is where it can be helpful to look at your members if they're helping out, right? And take a brief survey of your team's skills and interests. So first and foremost, can they stay for the entire project? This might feel like a silly question, but working with students, I can't tell you how many times we've had somebody be like, yeah, I'll be there. And then they're like, well, I have class at noon. And I'm like, the project went till 1. So you want to make sure that you have folks that can stay the entire time. If it's an early morning project, Are they cool with an early morning? Will they get up? Can they get there in time? Do they like behind the scenes work? Do they like helping more, wrangle those admin and logistical tasks? Or are they somebody that's really excited to be out in front talking with volunteers? Are they happy to collaborate with others, or do they like to take a project and run with it? Do they have a specific knowledge about any project tasks, or maybe they want to learn or practice a specific skill set like public speaking? Or do they have a hidden talent or a resource you should know about? Maybe they're a photographer or they own a truck, or maybe they can bench 200 pounds, and love leading icebreakers. These are all, hidden talents that can come in handy on a day of service. Finally, are they reliable? Do you believe they will show up on time? And are there any concerns about their commitment? This last question might feel a bit strange to ask directly, but it's really worth checking in to make sure that they are committed, and pay attention if it seems like they might be waffling or if they have a history of not following through. So once you have that implementation team, this is the time you want to go back, revisit that run of show, and revise it before you train your leads so that you have everybody's name next to what it is that they're responsible for. So during training, you want to provide a copy of that run of show to everybody on your implementation team so that each person can see exactly where they're needed, what they'll be doing, and who they might be working with. You also want to revisit those initial whys, right? So going back to what is it that you're trying to meet when you're what goals you're trying to meet when you're doing this project? Are all of those whys being met? And if not, go through and adjust. So, for example, that Binkathon, we realized although we intended for the event to be family friendly and allow kids 6 and older to join, we had planned a 4 to 5 hour long event. We didn't have nearly enough breaks for all of those families that are coming with their kids. So we had to go back and adjust expectations, length of activity, that sort of thing. Once you have a finalized run of show, you're going to want to finalize your 24-hour checklist to also ensure that you've identified every single person and what they're going to be doing leading up to that event day itself. So assigning your leads is one thing, but making sure that you have a plan to orient and train them prior to the start of the project, and ideally before the day itself, so no one feels rushed and any questions can be fully addressed. So you really want to take the time to ensure that each member has the information and training necessary to successfully guide others on the day of the event. It's one thing to know how to lead volunteers, that's an important skill, but it's another thing to lead volunteers in a very specific task. So experiential, hands-on, on-site training is often far more effective for your leads than sending folks home with a position description or a packet to read or an email to skim. A team lead training should cover what their role is and how to do it. Ideally, again, this includes hands-on demonstrations if you're able to meet with them in person, and also any safety considerations or training that they need to be able to pass along to the volunteers. You should review the various whys behind your event, make sure your leads understand how their role will support the event's purpose. Leads should also know who else is on the implementation team and which roles may work together or rely on one another. For example, the folks working the registration table at the Binkathon really needed to know who those area experts were so they could point volunteers in the right direction after getting them checked in. Similarly, leads should be briefed on what communication will look like on the day of the event. If the project spans a large area, will communication, be via call, chat, walkie-talkie, all of that stuff. If issues arise, you should have one designated person to contact for questions and support, or, if somebody's running late. Finally, make sure you remind folks what time they need to show up, what to bring or where to park, where to enter the building, especially if they're getting to the site before any signs are put up. So if your run of show is in order, your supplies are gathered, and your implementation team is trained, you're on track for a successful day of service event. As we wrap up today, I want to share just a couple leadership lessons that I've learned over the years that have been valuable in leading these types of events. I hope you also find them helpful as you dig into leading your own service events. So first of all, if your project has any kind of supplies, tables, or stations that need to be set up, highly recommend taking the time to sketch out a map of your project site in advance. This is going to help you think through the flow of the event, what layout makes the most sense, so you're not scrambling on the day of. In thinking through the Binkathon, we knew we needed to have plenty of seating for our sewing machine folks, but for our non-sewing machine crew, it really took making this map to determine we needed a lot, like a big clean floor space for folks that were going to be pinning all of those blankets. but we wanted to make sure that we had tables set up for anyone who couldn't endure sitting on the ground. We also designated a specific spot for all of those finished blankets so that volunteers could visually see them pile up and see the progress everyone was making. So having a map of the space on hand is an easy way to streamline your setup on the day of, and don't feel like you have to spend a lot of time making it formal, right? A quick hand-drawn sketch is generally going to make do. All right, second, what makes a meaningful kickoff? And how do you balance having a meaningful kickoff with the practical components of the project? Well, as we talked about earlier, your kickoff really needs to underline that primary why behind your event. Think about what would drive home the purpose of the work they'll be doing that day. Who's it going to help? Whose voices might you elevate to help explain that why? This is also a great time to think about adding in issue area education. So if you have time, go beyond mentioning the why and just think more about the context of the project and what folks maybe should learn. What do food security issues actually look like in your community and how are they being addressed? Maybe what value do those native plants actually bring to a local park? What role does child literacy play in a child's future development? So during our first Binkathon event, the organization's founder did speak about the value and comfort that those homemade blankets can bring to children experiencing hardship. But while she shared those names of the organizations and a bit about their missions, the why just wasn't that strong, right? So for future events, we decided to actually invite someone from the receiving organization to share more about their work and really be the ones to emphasize the why behind the blankets that we were making. In addition to underlining the why, you're also going to want to get volunteers jazzed about being there. The kickoff speakers should thank folks for coming, bring some enthusiasm and energy to the group. And whether that means getting people to introduce themselves, share what brought them out that day, or getting a large group to maybe turn and give a closing cheer or high five the person next to them, there are a number of ways to bring some energy and connection to your initial kickoff. Finally, while it may seem like a no-brainer to have your kickoff be the first thing volunteers experience after they sign in, the realities of larger days of service is that it may take you a full 30, maybe 45 minutes to get everyone checked in between those early arrivals and your stragglers. So having folks just sit twiddling their thumbs as they wait for a kickoff can be a recipe for boredom. So I do recommend you might have some volunteers go through an initial training, maybe start working on a task, and then come back together for that full kick-in once you have the majority of folks there. Third tip, monitoring and managing your volunteers. So as volunteers begin to dig into the project tasks themselves, it can be really tempting to just kind of join in as if you're another volunteer. And while I definitely recommend that leads join in some capacity where possible, know that monitoring, managing, and troubleshooting is a role in and of itself. And this requires a certain amount of awareness and attention. So be realistic with yourself about how much you'll be able to engage in the hands-on work while still being available to keep an eye on the larger picture. One of the key components of a lead's role in monitoring and managing the service itself is to pay attention to the individual volunteers working in your area. Do folks seem to understand the task at hand, or do you see looks of confusion as volunteers start their role? As a lead, it's on you to check in with your team as the event moves along, whether that means proactively checking for questions, maybe striking up a conversation with a solo volunteer to help them feel involved, or helping folks get introduced to one another, suggesting they might pair up on a certain part of the project. So at the Binkathon, we told our area leads not just to train new solo volunteers on the task at hand, but also try and introduce them to other volunteers in their area so they felt like they actually had a group to join. Remember, though, not everyone wants to be connected to others. Some folks are happy to work alone, so take note if someone shies away from a suggested introduction. As a lead, you can also be a helpful source of reminders. So reminding folks to take breaks, drink some water if it's hot, grab snacks if they're available. You'll also want to give them a heads up when you've got maybe 30, 15, 10 minutes left, kind of depending on the level of cleanup needed. And do reiterate that plan for wrapping things up. If you're going to be gathering for a closing reflection, set that expectation up front that folks should stick around till the end as you share their gratitude as they start helping clean up. And then last tip, when wrapping things up, I truly believe the best service projects are the ones that really bookend the volunteer experience with that connection to the larger purpose. In addition to incorporating the why into your kickoff, close your event with it too. Ensure your volunteers remember that why by giving them time to reflect on what they just did and how it connects to the larger picture. A closing reflection can underline the value of the work, allowing participants to share what they learned and how they might want to stay involved. So a common structure for closing reflections you might be familiar with is that what, so what, now what model, which invites participants to reflect on 3 different levels. The first round asks what, so questions like, what did we just do? What was your favorite moment? What did you just learn? What was surprising? And then we ask, so what? Why does this experience matter? What impact did we have? How does the work tie back to that why? And finally, we invite folks to consider, now what? How do you want to stay involved? What are other ways we can address the issue moving forward? This last question can help participants build that bridge to further action if they take a moment to pause and consider what they'd like to do next. So that's the last of my leader tips for today. I hope some of the examples and resources shared in this past hour will provide a useful blueprint to help guide you as you take on days of service leadership or support your VISTA team in leading their own projects. Now I'm going to pass it back over to Andy for one final activity.
All right, thanks, Malia. We have one final question, this one so you can see how well you've been following along. You'll see a poll question pop up on your screen, and the question is, the Run a Show is a planning tool designed to help you with all of the following except which of these? Is it determining the why of the event, matching members to roles, confirming that you have all the materials and supplies for the event, or identifying talking points for the welcome? So which of those 4 is something that the Run a Show will not help you with? Give you a few seconds to finish that, and we'll see how well you do. All right, looks like responses are slowing down. This is your last chance to get your answer in. Be sure you click submit so that it gets registered. But we'll go ahead and reveal the correct answer. And that is determining the why. So you should have the why determined already before you get to creating the Run a Show. That happens during initial planning. But a Run a Show can help you with those other 3 things. So great work on that activity. Looks like most of you got that right. Let's see, we're going to move on, and I'm going to jump ahead. We do have an evaluation form. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this session, what you enjoyed about it. You'll find a survey in the chat if the survey is not already open in your browser window. And I want to invite you to our next webinar next month on Thursday, August 15th. It's on writing a quality project report. You'll see invitation in your inbox in just a week or so. We've got a link that we'll paste in the chat so you can go ahead and register. All right, thank you so much. I want to thank our presenter, Malia Hadidian-Titchener, for sharing with us today. Also, thanks to our instructional design team, Vanessa Francis, Cameron Greenup, and Elizabeth Floyd, and our producer today, Stephanie Natoli. And most of all, thank you for participating. That concludes our webinar. We hope to see you again.